A very warm welcome to you all for this special Christmas edition of our regular Summit series of webinars, where we probe all saddlery matters. This is part 2 of our rigid versus flexible saddle design presentation with Maria Hallring of ErgoX2 Saddles of Sweden and Bradley Whale of Ipotane Saddles in the UK. I'll be brief with my introduction, as we had a lengthy intro for part 1. I'm Caroline Lindsay, President of the Professional Saddle Fitters Association and PhD student, focusing on rider pain, posture and performance. Our two presenters are truly cutting-edge innovators, and although their designs would appear to be from opposite ends of the spectrum, there are many similarities as they evolve their designs. Bradley is also an osteopath and engineer, and Maria has extensive experience with working with leading saddle designers on the continent and the US. We ran out of time to hear Bradley's presentation last time, having extended the session by an hour. So we'll begin with that tonight. And last week, Maria focused on forces and defined some important principles. And we also discussed panel pressure and rider and horse forces. Bradley gave us a taster of what's in his presentation, and he warned us that he was going to get controversial. So work away, Bradley. We like controversy. It's good, academic controversy. And Maria will also contribute further perspectives, and then I'll ask both of them to clarify the reasons why they have selected their respective saddle types, if it has not become obvious by then, as your personal preference. And I would like you to also explain the applications of each type, rigid or flexible, and what we really need to know about the pros and cons of each type. Okay, so it's over to you, Bradley.
Okay, can you there we go. Fantastic. Hang on. Can I share?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, carry on. We'll take questions as and when. I'll feed them through.
Okay, why aren't you why am I not?
Oh, sorry, I've got to sign you in.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I was going to say.
There we go.
There we go. Right. There we go. Ta-da! Right, we're on. Happy Christmas, everybody. So just to warn you, first and foremost, I must make an apology. Please ignore all the mess behind. It's because I've got Christmas jobs to do in our house. So between Christmas and New Year, I've got loads of DIY to do. So that's my job. Enjoy Christmas. I hate DIY. Anyway, so today we're talking about treeless, treed and hybrid saddles. I'm here basically to talk to you about hybrid saddles. But the difficulty is being a hybrid saddle designer and innovator and so on and so forth, you end up having to look at both ends of the spectrum. And it is a sliding scale, it is a spectrum. So hopefully today we'll explain in greater detail what is a hybrid saddle. You know, it's pretty obvious by the name, but you know, we want to explain it all, and we'll go through videos, pictures, and explain logic. So today, obviously, we've got treed, treeless, and hybrids. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. So this is what we're looking at is the lovely three parts of our industry. So what is the problem? And why do hybrid saddles even exist? You know, why is there treed and treeless saddles? The reason being is actually pretty simple. Horses' backs vary massively. They change in shape with the seasons. They change with training. They change with feeding. They're constantly in a state of flux. Riders are also in a similar state of flux, but not to the same degree that horses are. We also require our horses to do a variety of different disciplines. essentially, from performance dressage to performance jumping to polo to hacking to everything. Therefore, we desire a product, ideally a saddle, which can handle all of those requirements and more. And I've kind of taken a bit of a mickey here by saying it's got to have Bluetooth connectivity and a cup holder and sat nav, because in some regards we are demanding quite a lot from a singular product. So we're demanding horses to do certain disciplines, and we have a variety of different riders, and we have a variety of variants within the horse, seasonally, nutritionally, demographically. There's a big difference. So all of a sudden, it becomes almost quite logical on the reasons why we have different products. The solution. It's not surprising that we have treed and treeless products. They're both ends of the spectrum. A treed product fundamentally, it has greater structure and greater rigidity and stability in theory, but there are problems with that. And whilst you have treeless, which is designed to be highly flexible and adaptable, but there's the potential for less structure. So you've got these polar ends of the spectrum, and we've had that for decades. For a large portion of the equine and saddle evolution over time, we've kind of had this polarizing debate. Treed or treeless, bareback pads or kind of rigid tree structures, and that's also organically grown depending on the history, the culture. For example, we as a Western culture, Europe, Britain, with knights in armor and so on and so forth, we were not able to have flexible saddles because you needed the rigidity within the product to hold a knight or a cavalryman on board. Whilst when you go to the Americas, the Africa, kind of Asia continents, they had much more flexible trees. They had much more flexible saddles because of their cultural difference, but also because of their the way they did war, the way they did certain essentially the way they did war. That's what it boils down to. So it's not surprising we've got this kind of massive polarization within the industry. It's only been a recent innovation with this hybridization, so where we've basically started to go for this middle ground, and in some regards hybridization can be a massive bonus in terms of it's there's all this potential, all of this, it could have the best of both worlds, or it could potentially have the worst. So you could get reduced flexibility, you could get reduced stability, and you get all the drawbacks of both elements. And it would be quite immature to turn around and say, if you've got a treed saddle or a treeless saddle, there's strengths and weaknesses in everything. And even with hybrid saddles, where the ultimate goal is to bring the two together, there are limitations. There's always limitations, and it's understanding the limitations of treed saddles and treeless and hybrids, and also variations of hybrids as well. And that's what we're going to try and do today. Now, this is a pretty obvious. I've put this as a scale, essentially from rigid to flexible, from treed saddle to treeless, and you've got this hybridization sat in the middle. Now, when we're looking at the concept of treed and treeless saddles, we've got to consider and look at the various innovations which have happened in order to get where we are now, where we're looking at what we call true hybridization, the true amalgamation of a treeless and a treed saddle. So when we're looking at this, we've got to look at the previous innovations and what other manufacturers and innovators and very intelligent people have done previously. Have they taken a rigid product product and essentially tried to make it more flexible? Or have they tried to make a very flexible product and try and create more rigidity? Because everyone's basically going for this lovely middle ground. That is, in some regards, I'm going to bit of a pun, but the holy land of saddlery, where you have the flexibility and the stability. So when we're looking at what is a hybrid, we have had to create the criteria. It's not been given to us by any industry. There is no organization which gives clear delineation between a treed and a treeless. There's very little organization, and how do you talk about a product which is trying to amalgamate two very opposing theories? So we had to come up with a criteria which kind of defines what we call a hybrid saddle. But we've then had to further split the hybrid saddle into two distinct groups, what we call true hybrids and basically adjusted hybrids. So products which have been adjusted to have hybridization or to have other features of the other end or the other aspects of treed and treeless saddles. So our criteria were basically, what was the original intention or theory? What's the original theory behind it? What are you trying to achieve? What is the design features which they put in? Is it a logical progression, or is it something which is something new, totally different, and conceptually very against the current thinking? What is the function? What is the function of the improvement? What are you trying to achieve with the new design or the new theory? Is it multiple, or is it singular? Are you just trying to make a gullet bar more flexible, or are you actually trying to then make various other components? So if you just have a flexible or an interchangeable gullet bar, well, that is in some form an adjusted hybrid in our view, because you've made a rigid product and you've now made it kind of more versatile. So therefore you have moved from that rigid tree structure along that scale to a more balanced structure. Fitting, for example, does the fitting protocol differ dramatically from the standard practice? If so, why? And I can always talk about that in terms of the measuring process or fitting process. Manufacturing, what is the manufacturing process to build a saddle? Is it using space age technology? Is it kind of using materials in a slightly different way? What is the clever component in terms of the manufacturing? Is it easier or harder to manufacture? And then ultimately the customer. Does the new design help the horse or rider equally? That goes a little bit back to the theory and the intention, or is there a disproportionate improvement? I.e., have you made a product which is disproportionately more effective for the horse, but is absolutely terrible for the rider? And vice versa, have you made a product which is fantastic for the rider, but is disproportionately not beneficial for the horse? Because you've got to remember, ultimately, horses will put up with some form of discomfort for a period of time. Well, some horses will. And then they will start expressing themselves. Horses are amazingly kind of subtle and very soft creatures. They will put up with a lot. So as we said earlier, I come in and I've created this criteria, and it wasn't dictated to me by an organization or anything like that. I've had to create it. So what we have is basically what we call adaptive hybrids and true hybrids. So we've put in, like, the adaptive hybrid is the Barry Swain semi-flex saddle. So for example, the way he's designed that was creating a rigid tree and then putting grooves in it to have it some form of flex. So again, he's created a product to then basically reduce to make it more flexible. We've put in the butterfly gullet bar. Again, it's a rigid tree structure, but you've made one component more flexible. There's nothing, we're not saying these are pros or cons. It is just trying to explain to the industry that you have these adaptive products where they originally start off as a rigid structure and they have been made to be more flexible. hinge saddles, multi-part saddles. They're all very capable products, but they all have slightly different ways that you fit them. They are also they are designed in certain ways to perform at certain tasks much more beneficial than others. And then what we have is true hybrids. Then we have our saddle, Ipotane. I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail if you don't want me to. We've then got the reactor saddle, the reactor panel saddle, and the cantilever saddle. The reason being is because those as a concept, those as a design, and from a very much a initial standpoint, they came at the industry and they came at saddlery from a very fundamental different aspect of intention and theory. And as I say, they hit all of that criteria, which indicated that it was not an adaptation of a product. It was a product built from its very foundation to be very different. So we have this, as I say, we've created. So this is where we start to have a little bit of fun. And as you said, as I mentioned earlier, we have the labradoodle. Hybrid can be what we comically call a labradoodle. And anybody who breeds dogs or anybody who knows anything about dogs is where you basically breed or hybridize two breeds, which is what they've done in the canine world, which is breed a Labrador and a poodle. Now, in that, guys, you could get the best of both components, so the best of the Labrador and the best of the poodle, or you could get the worst. So the difficulty is that adaptive products or adaptive hybrids, they start from the origin point of the extreme, for example, a treed or a treeless. And for example, I will use a treed saddle as a starting point because let's be fundamentally honest, there are more products out there which are rigid structures, which are then making themselves more flexible than there are necessarily treeless saddles, which are making themselves more rigid. And there are various ways to a treeless saddle can make themselves more rigid. But for example, if you make a treed saddle more flexible, then there is a greater potential for the saddle to move or slip. And also this happens vice versa. So it's always turning around and going, okay, if you have a rigid tree structure and you make a component, whatever component that is, it's whether points or it's the tree body or it's the gullet bar, stirrup bar position, whatever, that one singular change will then impact how the saddle performs, how it is fitted, and it can have unknown or unexpected repercussions.
Can I ask you a question for everyone, Bradley?
Yeah,
okay, so I would like us to maybe touch on where does the saddle need to be flexible and in what way?
Right, so that is that is coming later on in a lot of the video work, but you are right. Where does a saddle need to be flexible? That very much comes down to the theory of where you want, like my interpretation of where you want flexibility and movement, and has impacted the design and impacted what I'm trying to achieve in my design and product. Where other people require flexibility is very different depending on their product and what they're trying to achieve. So
we have a common idea and maybe your idea.
Well, no. It's not me against everybody else. It's not that. It's more that, for example, okay, right. So let me, when you look at the horse's spine and the spinal shape, if you look at the spine in thirds, let's use Jochen's lovely example of splitting a saddle into thirds. You generally want the rider to sit in the middle, but where do you want that rider? You want the rider to sit in the middle of the tree, but where do you want the rider to sit on the horse's back? Now, the two are not the same, and this is where, as I said, I'll show you later on, is because there's a paramount difference between saddle fitting and saddle design. And there's a fundamental disconnect between the industry, between the saddle designers and the saddle fitters. And I'll show you in pictures and videos.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because fitters are trying to place the rider somewhere where the saddle is not designed to place the rider.
Yeah, exactly.
This is where I differ. So why I do get fitters to come to me, because they're like, oh, suddenly I can put the rider where I wanted the rider to be without the saddle not being where I didn't want it to be.
Yes. So this is what I mean is when you're, and this is the problem, and this is why it's frustrating, because when you have two very different concepts between treed and treeless saddles, they have very different fitting concepts. So you've not only got a different design, but you now have a different fitting principle. And then somebody like myself, which is a hybrid designer, who's basically looking at the two ends of the spectrum, is then looking at both kind of parties, both designs, but also then both fitting protocols, and actually kind of go, well, hang on, what is everyone after? What are everyone trying to achieve? So that's why then you'll find a lot of hybrid saddles are amalgamating different fitting principles from, has it got to be 2 inches further back from the shoulder, or is there flexibility to allow the saddle to move forward, or so on and so forth? Do saddles actually need to be further? Do they need to be bigger? All of these principles. And the difficulty is as somebody like myself who's hybrid, you almost have to make a choice, and a very selective choice, of what you choose in terms of what is the principle I'm going to choose for saddle fitting, what is the principle I'm going to choose to design.
Are those two principles, if I get you right, and everyone who might listen, is that, am I going to allow the saddle to actually go over the shoulder and allow that movement? Or am I going to try to stay behind the shoulder, but then risking that as the shoulder moves, it's going to be pushing on my saddle if I haven't done anything to allow the shoulder to move?
Absolutely. And then you've got the next problem which occurs within the industry, is that you have what we call conformational bias. So that's where people are trained under a certain tutelage. And then they find it very difficult to look or understand or accept another viewpoint, because they become a little bit, they have a system which works for them, and it works very, very well, but they then become quite closed-minded. And that's not a negative, it's a way of protecting ourselves and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with it. But the difficulty is we have a system of fitting a saddle. So, for example, the predominant, let's be brutally honest, the predominant product out on the market is a rigid tree structure. And we generally have, and there's a huge amount within the industry which has for decades been talking about, you've got to fit a saddle 2 inches off the shoulder, 2 inches off the shoulder. And now the reason being is essentially, I'm going to say this in a slightly rude way, but the saddle design and saddle fitting.
That's why we're here.
Yeah. Well, okay, basically, saddle fitters have had to push a saddle 2 inches further back to allow for shoulder rotation. So essentially, they've had to bodge it, because saddle designers have not stepped up to the plate and actually designed new products. They have essentially just allowed an industry fitters to do a workaround, do a bodge.
I only know one designer who has actually worked with the distances of the first third and the second third.
Yeah.
And, I worked with those products for 15 years, and I kept wondering when the rest of the industry was going to catch up.
Yeah. Now, so the problem is,
it hasn't happened.
You've got this disparity between fitters. So fitters have had to essentially bodge their entire career, their entire product line, 2 inches further back, because all a saddle designer has to do is just look at a design and go, well, actually, the saddle wants to sit in a certain place. Well, just design it differently. But saddle designers have basically just been lazy. So you've got a laziness within the manufacturing and the design phase, which then means that the poor fitters are sat there going, well, I have to push it further back. Now, the difficulty is with that, is that has implications in terms of girthing structure and so on and so forth. So then you've got the fitters are saying, well, I've fixed one problem by pushing it 2 inches further back, but now I've created another problem because the saddle wants to slip forward. So you've fixed a problem, but now you've created another. And again, you've got this constant arguing back and forth between the fitting community and the manufacturers and the design community, and no one really wants to take any responsibility.
And the other problem that they're getting is, once they have pushed the saddle back there, the waist of the saddle is, and the stirrup bar is now in the wrong place, where the horse is going wider and the saddle isn't wide enough. So a lot of these saddles actually dive in the front.
Yep.
And as they dive, something happens because the rider's position is then pushed forward because the saddle is dived. So now the rider sometimes is actually thinking that this is working. If they needed to get forward on the horse, but all the pressure is now under the first third of the saddle.
Exactly. So you've got this disparity. Now, as somebody who's a hybrid designer and everything, you're looking at the two ends of the spectrum. Now, the other difficulty is that you're looking at, so for example, a lot of the industry uses rigid tree structures, and what they've done is they've pushed it 2 inches further back. That fitting concept has also been accepted and utilized by the treeless community. So now you've got treeless saddles, which are then also fitted 2 inches further back because people don't understand the product. And then all of a sudden, you're starting to look at the whole concept of saddle fitting, and you go, right, the whole concept of saddle fitting is flawed. Just from a physics perspective, and we'll get onto that slightly later when you start seeing some of the images. But you start looking at the whole concept of how we fit products, and it's flawed from not only concept and design of product to actual manufacturing to fitting protocol to muscular development, everything. The whole industry is to a greater or lesser degree flawed, and that's even from the point of education. You and me, Maria, are doing these kind of lectures and various things like that to educate people. This should be done by organizations. It should not be done by necessarily individuals like myself, who I'm having to go and do all the research, such as the historical research. I'm passionate, I love it, there's nothing wrong with it, but I should have a database to go to. There should be a database of saddles and trees and all of that. It doesn't exist. None of this exists. And you sit there and go, the industry is flawed in terms of the education. Then you've got a flooring as well of the research. Research is flawed because the very concept of research, especially in the saddle industry, I've not seen anybody question the very basics of saddle fitting or the principles of saddle fitting in terms of research. They're very busy looking at panel shape or girthing structure or girthing positions and saddle positions, and you're sat there going, well, fundamentally, you haven't looked at you need to start with the basics first. So in some form, research is to a degree slightly flawed, because it's always born with a slightly inherent piece of bias. So
there is no organization really buying.
And that's where it becomes frustrating. We're having these conversations. Me having to create the criteria to explain what a hybrid saddle is. You have products which are adapting their product line. You have companies which are adapting their product line to make it more flexible, but they're not educating. They're just saying how amazing their product is, but they're not actually educating the industry. You need to educate the industry so that people can make informed decisions, and so it is non-biased. You should have an organization which essentially is a non-biased entity to just sit there and go, Here is the information. Here are all the data sheets. Here is all of that type of stuff.
Okay.
That is then for the fitters to create that specialist and the expertise.
When the absolute first pressure test was done, it was being done in Sweden.
Yeah.
By Rupsdorf, and I was participating first, but I was again a difficult person, because I said to them that before you do any pressure testing on the horses, you need to rate the horses' top lines from some measures and what they look like. So you need to know if you have a short back, long back, high with a low with a wide back, dip back, straight back. And then you need to do the same with the saddles you look at before you put them on and do any kind of pressure testing. And unfortunately, they came back and they said, that somebody would need to do a PhD on that before we can even do it. And I was like, that's kind of what
that is. I'm a big advocate for standardization in terms of products. Because it protects the industry. I've written pieces on it explaining that it will protect the industry, it will boost the industry's income, it will boost the manufacturer's income, it will boost the fitter's income, it will boost the customers. You sit there and go, how do you lose in this? But it is what it is. They don't want it. But as I say, the difficulty is you have an industry at the moment which is trying to get is quite combative. It's trying to go, right, are you treeless or treed? And you're sat there going, right, why are you sat there making it a basically a choice between two? Why can't we go for the middle ground? And that's where this hybridization has only really started to come in the last kind of decade or two. And that's really quite fascinating, because you've got this almost kind of balanced opinion. And I've spoken to the inventor of the reactor panels, and I've spoken to the inventor of the cantilever, and
so have I.
When you speak to them, you understand that what they're willing to give and what they're willing to take, because everything is about balance in terms of a hybridized product. You understand the two extremes. You can't achieve the two extremes. You can't. You have to kind of go, right, okay, I'm going to give the horse flexibility, or I'm going to give the rider stability. Well, okay, how are you going to do that? Because the two are polar opposite in terms of their achievements. So what are you willing to sacrifice? And that's where, as I say, if you're using something like an adaptive hybrid, you've already started from the concept of rigidity. And what they're doing is then reducing the rigidity. But that has untold or unexpected results. As I say, if you make a tree more flexible, a rigid tree more flexible, it is going to have an increased risk of slippage.
And if we look at the products that are out there that have made trees, they're all plastic trees.
Yeah.
So if we talk about what they've done, they made them. They made them so you can twist them a little bit. They made them so that as things move in the back, that the saddle is going to give a little bit in the back end. And they've also then worked on the front end. But what we found from early Prestige, for example, was that as soon as you have a fairly narrow horse and have a tree that opens in the front, the tree will actually come down more and sit tighter on the horse. So there's been a lot of trials and errors in this. And I think that, then people realize that, okay, you cannot make the tree that soft in the front without actually dropping on a narrow horse. It's a different story on a wider horse. And I don't know how soft they are now in the rear end, or from the middle to the rear end. And if that concept is actually doing anything for the horses, I don't know. Would you say?
Well, there are companies which are looking at that.
Yeah.
I know of a company which is splitting a saddle into thirds, essentially, and they're trying to hinge it. And there's pros and cons. Like everything. If you try and design a product with one philosophy, then it will work for some, but it won't work for all. And this is where you start looking at hybrids. You know, you have to, and this is where, as I say, if we start looking at like what we call the Labradoodle, the true hybrid. So you've got Labradoodle, the adaptive hybrid, and you've got Labradoodle, the true hybrid. So if you have a true hybrid, from its very core and concept, has been designed to fit both the horse and the rider, logically that's the best answer. But in order to achieve that, you have to question everything. And you have to break every single rule. You have to test every single theory. You have to basically question the very fundamentals. Because if you, so for example, like us, if you make a product which is highly flexible for one creature and highly stiff for another, when you start looking at other components which are in addition to the saddle, i.e. girthing or numbers or anything like that, exactly, you suddenly have to look at those concepts, look at those and how that influences the product. You no longer can just make one product. You have to make a product and then understand the ramifications of that change, of that tweak, whatever that is, or of that theory, and the ramifications of that into other products and other fitting protocols and other industries and so on and so forth. So this is where it becomes quite difficult from a designer or a hybrid manufacturing perspective, because you are always, to a greater or lesser point, learning and changing the product. Now, this goes back to what Maria was very kindly trying to point to earlier on, where she was kind of going, where is the stability point? And that's why I was kind of going, just wait, because here is what I kind of wanted to sit and talk about. Because when you look at the horse's back, if you, as I said, you use that kind of 3-section process, or section up the saddle or the horse's back into 3 sections, 3 clear, distinct sections. Every section along that third is performing a different type of movement to a different degree. So, for example, around the wither, you have an element of elevation, but you do not have lateral expansion. But what you do have a lot of is shoulder rotation forward and backwards. So you have a lot of AP movement going on. So you have this large percentage which is AP movement, shoulders rotating forward and backwards. You have a degree of kind of spinal elevation, but you have very little lateral elevation. Compare that to the last third, where actually you have little to no AP movement going on. What you do have is then a lot of lateral expansion because of the rib cage and the floating rib. And you do have superior and inferior elevation. So you now have a different percentage of those 3 kind of movement patterns. You have a different percentage. So when you look at the middle third, you sit there and go, well, the middle third is not getting any AP kind of rotation. It is impacted, but it has no direct impact from the shoulder blades. It has secondary and compensatory AP movement because of the muscular development. So the problem is the middle third is having to do a little bit of everything. So it is having to compensate for a little bit of AP movement. It's having to do a lot of superior and inferior elevation. It does a little bit of lateral expansion, but it's not as much as an extreme as the other 2 thirds, the front third and the back third. So all of a sudden, when you've got like Maria turn around and go, right, okay, so where is the optimum position? You sit there and go, well, if you look at people who ride bareback, where do they sit? They sit at the base of the wither, so the lowest point in the horse's back. And that is the balance point. That's what we call the balance point. And in mathematics, it's in what we've talked about or what I talked about is what we call the mathematic equation, which is a hyperbolic paraboloid. That is what is called the saddle point in mathematics, but is what we call the central point. Now, what's important is if you sit on or near that central point, when the horse's back elevates, you're sat on that balance point. So therefore, the elevation, the horse lifts. You're not behind the movement. You're not in front of the movement. You're on it. You're lifted up with the movement. And because it is the central point, the balance point, you are sat there at the nexus. You can feel everything, but you are not affected by it. Whilst if you are sat behind the balance point or in front of the balance point or off to the side of the balance point, you are always then being knocked. You are always being impacted by the other aspects or the other 2/3. So the front third and the back third. So hence why we're looking at this kind of central third.
And if we talk about this in a rider's language, the rider instantly will feel that it's easy to ride, because they will feel that they are not bounced about, they are not behind, and the horse is not reacting to them as hard, so that they are becoming synchronized with the horse because they're above where the horse wants to carry as well.
Yeah.
So just a couple of questions here. I was just scribbled down a whole page full, and we've got some coming through. So we know we want a stable rider. We know that stability, that there is a sweet spot on the horse's back.
Yep.
And we've only really got to look at the bull riders, rodeo riders. They are really getting themselves right in behind the shoulder so they can stay on. Ooh.
Go on, spit it out. Go on.
So with your flexible saddle, you're allowing the horse to move. You're giving them the freedom of movement.
Yeah.
And that freedom of movement is, in theory, it's balance, which makes it easier to sit on the horse. So how much stability does the rider need? Obviously, we could argue that stability should be intrinsic, so that the rider creates their own stability. So
it's also stability and flexibility. So the rider needs to have the stability within their core, but not that. There's a big misunderstanding quite often which I see with horse riders is, when you talk about stability, they get confused in terms of strength, how strong you are, how much you can engage those muscles. And actually, you sit there and gotta go, no. It's talking about engaging the muscles by 20 or 30%. It is not 100% contraction, because that makes you hard. And with hardness, that creates stiffness. And stiffness means that you are more prone to the impact of force. Think about the difference between throwing a ball at a rigid structure. Then the rigid structure, you can knock it over. It will, if there's a domino that's hit up and you throw a ball at it, it will kind of react because of the impact. Whilst if you have a piece of elastic, when you throw the ball at it, the elastic takes up and soaks up the kinetic energy and then displaces it in other ways, shapes and forms. Now, that's what you're looking for, is in terms of balance of the rider. You want that flexibility, but you also want that structural engagement, which is actually a lot less than what most people think. Most people think, oh, I must engage my core, I must be really strong. You're sat there going, no, you actually have to engage your core probably 30, maybe 50% of the actual full contraction. And the really funny part is, once you've got people to understand that they don't have to engage the muscle so strong, is when you tell them how to pulse. And actually you say, right, don't actually engage the muscle the whole 15 minutes, 45-minute riding session. You engage, release, engage, release, engage, release. And that is the beautiful part, is getting people to really connect with that flexibility and stability as well, which is, from a philosophical perspective, but this is why I get quite energetic, because you sit there and kind of go, the point of a saddle, especially from a hybrid perspective, is very much trying to get that flexibility and trying to get that stability. The point of a rider is to try and have that flexibility and that stability and that pulsing action where it's moving in time. It's the rhythm, it's the synchronicity. And that is really quite difficult. It is a true skill to learn, and it is the aspect of a true phenomenal rider is not necessarily their ability to be strong or anything like that. It is the ability to change the pulse or the rhythm of engagement, and the flexibility and the stability in rhythm and in movement patterns of the particular horse in front of them. You know, ultimately horses move in a certain way, and it is our job as riders and saddle designers and everything like that is to help enhance that movement, but also help the riders to move in that horse's particular pattern. That is the true skill of any rider.
And this seems to be where rigid saddles are not hitting the spot in terms of being able to facilitate the rider's pulsing.
No,
But
no.
how?
Wait.
How does the flexible saddle perform then? So, you know, is this about economics? That's what I want to know.
No, it's not about the saddle being rigid. It's about how the rider's pelvis is meeting the horse and how easy it is for the rider to keep the core on, because the core is a readiness. The core can be switched on just by how you make the rider sit.
Yeah.
So we found that if you don't force the rider to do a lot of work to actually just sit, the core will be switched on because the body thinks it's standing up.
Yeah.
So that is more about position. And the reaction you will have from people then is, oh, this was so easy. If you take professionals who used to work hard, this is like a Sunday walk in the park, they say. And the only reason they're feeling it's easy is because, just like Bradley say, they're not having to force their muscles to be on, because a lot of riders think they're using the core. In what they're actually using are their global muscles, you know, their big long muscles, their big long back muscle and their long belly muscle, because they're not in balance. So they are compensating instead of actually using the, you know, the muscle we talked about before, Caroline, that goes all the way around you.
Transverse abdominis.
Yeah. So, and when that is on together with other muscles, you know, it will just protect you. Yes, that's if you're walking. But if you're not in the right position, it can't happen.
Yeah. So if the rigid treed saddle is not conformed to the rider's pelvis, then it can impede
where the rider needs to be.
Okay. Yeah.
But
this is what Bradley's saying. If you have the rider in the wrong place.
I'm now going to throw something into the mix on top of that, is because when you look at a rigid tree structure, there are other materials which are then, for want of a better word, soaking up the movement. So this is where, you know, you've got to not only look, and this is where we inherently, as designers and creators and people who are educated and so on, so we always want to focus onto one element, which is the causative factor. You know, that's the principle of the scientific methodology. The difficulty is actually, if you look at a rigid tree structure, there's panels, there's padding, there's leather, all of these other associated materials which are designed to soak up that movement pattern as well. Now, obviously, a treeless is designed, it can soak up a lot of that padding as well, but the difficulty is it doesn't have the rigid structure. So to some greater or lesser degree, some people feel a lot and they feel unstable because of that. So the difficulty is that you can't just comparatively look at the tree. You've also then got to look at other associated materials. Like we've done testing with our product, where we have had, because our product, we can take the panels off quite easily and we can put new panels on. So we've basically got a mechanical horse, and then filled the panels with different materials.
Cool.
And it was exactly the same tree, you know, it was exactly the same situation, all done on a day. And it's different materials, and we've done a variety, even materials which you would never use on a product in any way, shape, or form. We used beanbag, the polystyrene balls, beanbags. like stuff. You would never put that on a saddle, but I'm nerdy and geeky and I wanted to find out. I just wanted to play. So you sit there and you just kind of go, right. And the variety of difference you get just by changing the material within the panel is phenomenal.
It's
so
astounding.
You sit there and kind of go, this isn't, it's not just, and this is where we've got to kind of really expand our thinking and kind of look at the bigger picture of the amalgamation of different materials and different kind of concepts together. It's not this kind of very singular treed, treeless, It is kind of, well, okay, if I have a treed saddle, but I have a certain material within the panel, which is hyper designed to be hyper flexible and soft and pliable, that is acting as a percentage wise, that's acting as a greater percentage to soak up the movement. Whilst if you have a rigid tree structure with then say a foam panel with hard rigid foam, which you generally see in high performance jumping saddles, there is very little flexibility within that product. So all of a sudden you can't just look at the singular component of a tree or a treeless.
I have to share my experience here because as making a semi-rigid tree, my tree isn't that rigid because we do bend it and put webbing in, but we have been forced for a long time to use different kind of stuffing. So we make a panel out of felt because wool is a wonderful material still in this high-tech world. And then we've been forced to have different kind of stuffings and different wools in there, and some of them have been synthetic. And our test rider and the test horses and the results we've had is that the more the wool can actually absorb and be hold, the higher density, the harder it is, a rider would say, the better reaction have been in the horses. And the more give there has been in the wool, the more bouncy it's been, the more it actually fills the panel up as a balloon. There's silicone wool out there, and it exists in some saddles. And this has absolutely no density whatsoever. So you think you're fitting the saddle to the horse. And this will actually, I've done it in my video in the course. I've shown how much it sinks when you put your hands on it compared to other wool. So there are lots of materials that are actually in saddles out there that they haven't done the geeky testing on because they just put it in. And they haven't really listened to, okay, what happens when you start jumping on this and the saddle is suddenly going all over the place. So you have to think about, if you're going to have a lot of impact and move, you need to stabilize stuff. You need a wool or a padding or a panel that is going to stabilize and not bounce you back up in the air. And there's a completely different story maybe if you're just out walking a horse. And there's a different story if you're dressaging the horse. It's a different story if you're heavy. There's a different story. I talked to a colleague in Australia. She used to have a panel with some air in it, and she's a GP rider. She had no problem whatsoever with riding in that. She put a client or a student in it. They were all over the place, and the horse was freaking out. So people who work with this, I think, you would need like a panel course, just, testing out what you did on that horse. Every saddle fitter needs to do it with different materials and with some different riders and horses to see what actually happens.
And this is why I get frustrated in some degrees with the industry, because you sit there and go, you should, as an organization, as an industry, you should have a bank of respected independent information which anybody can go to. Customer, fitter, manufacturer, anything like that. It shouldn't be that, for example, like myself, who has to go off and pay my own private to go off and do research and testing and do it in my own spare time, when actually it should be provided to a greater or lesser degree.
Are you saying we should start a Hippopedia?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I mean. There needs to be and that's what the organisation is for. That is what an organisation should do. is they should provide you with the basics, and then anybody who comes out with weird designs or crazy designs or anything or new materials, then obviously that's in addition of, but the same basics, the types of foam or the types of flock or the types of leather, those are standard practices, and they need to be standardized and to a degree of just having that information out for the younger generation who are coming up through, and there's none of that. So all of a sudden you've got loads of companies which are doing, and I can guarantee I've done the research, some other company has done the research, another company before that has done the research, and we've all held on to our little pieces of research and we've not shared it. And you sit there and kind of go, it's just silly, really, at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, if I can do my research and I can advance somebody else's design later on in life or near the end of my career or whatever, then that's a bonus, because ultimately at the end of the day, horses win and customers win and fitters win and the industry wins. So you sit there and go, why are we all holding back? And it is because there's lack of certain things within the industry which inhibits people. There's we're all trying to get one above everybody else to varying degrees, which is quite idiotic in my view at the end of the day.
So I can tell, like from analysing the research that I've done, where I've asked, do you use rigid, do you use flexible? And I can see that the flexible saddles are getting popular. Now, whether there is a certain amount of them that the horse cannot be fitted in a rigid saddle for, they just don't, nothing to fit them. So I think what we really need to know is if somebody's going to select a flexible saddle, then it sounds like it must have a certain degree or some degree of stability built into it for the rider, even though the rider perhaps has got a high degree of intrinsic stability. So can you just talk me through, if I came to you and I said, I'm going to acquire a flexible saddle because my horse can't have a rigid tree saddle, what would that make you think? What are your parameters for fitting a flexible? So I'm saying like not a hybrid and not a rigid. What must, if I cannot have either or, and I can only have a flexible saddle, what do I need to know?
Does Maria want to go first, or does me want to go first?
I'll be shorter, so I'll go first then. Okay, so I would first look at what your weight is, what type of horse you have, the kind of stability that horse has.
Okay.
I would look at your physical ability to stabilize yourself,
right,
and your riding experience. Because I would say that if you have a decent ability to stabilize yourself laterally and vertically, and you have a horse that has decent muscles, and you don't have a problem with riding as wide as you might end up in a treeless saddle, that you can still get above your legs, so that you have your legs under you and not in front of you. Then I said, you could probably, go ahead and try to see if you can find a treeless saddle that's going to fit you and your horse, and where the horse responds well and keeps responding well within 2-3 months.
Right.
Because if you see that the horse starts to become harder in the back, I've been following things that are too soft on the market, because I like to follow things that go either one way or the other. And one of the reports I was getting back from the fitters, and then I kept asking, was that, okay, so if you have a sway back horse and you put something that's quite soft on there, because you are bouncing, every time you come down, the horse will tense its back. So you're actually giving it a signal to tense its back. That signal also sends the horse forward. So we were finding that horses with that had a sway back that weren't using it sometimes actually benefited from the softer saddle first. But then the interesting thing happened. After they come up, they became rock hard. So it's so you have to follow this, because what might be positive in the first 2 months might end up being a negative after 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. So although there is, in theory, less maintenance for a flexible saddle, you need more maintenance for the horse. You can't just put a pad on and forget about it. And also, I was just mindful there of kissing spines, because I am aware of a horse that has developed kissing spines that you wouldn't expect, and they have been using a flexible treed saddle. And good rider, strong rider, light rider. So it should, in theory, it should not have happened. But it was what you just said there about the bouncing of the rider onto the horse's back that potentially could create a potential for kissing spines. So we do need to know about the back health of the horse.
We need a study that actually compares riders that sit correctly on the right spot, on the vertical, and ride in a treeless saddle, to riders who are slightly behind the vertical, slightly too far back, and slightly unbalanced, because I think you're going to get very different results.
Okay,
so
I think I can do that.
The softer the saddle is, the better the rider has to be, and the better trained the horse need to be able to lift up under that.
So it all comes back to stability. Yeah. Okay. Bradley, sorry, I interrupted.
No, go for it. So again, I look at things from the point of view of measured and calculable outcomes. So again, very much like Maria, you would measure, what are you trying to, if you have a treeless saddle, and what are you trying to essentially then make stiffer? Are you trying to make it stiffer for the horse, or are you trying to make it stiffer for the rider? And as in your situation, sorry, you said you've got a well-balanced rider. So in which case you have a horse which needs the flexibility of the movement. So you start off, again, what Maria said, what works now may mean that you actually later on are going to need a slightly different product, or you would need a product which has a degree of adaptability built into it, so that, for example, you can start off with a highly flexible treeless saddle to then implement and put in, for example, I'm just going to spit this out, stiffening components or stiffening rods or stiffening panels or anything like that, in order to increase the load, theoretically the load bearing force. So you've got to, and this is again, Maria and Caroline, you've jumped the gun. I was going to do this big reveal later on. But essentially, you shouldn't be looking at the industry now from the point of view of polarizing, but you're also needing these elements of adaptability to bring in a product into this kind of central component. So, for example, whether it is a treed saddle to become more flexible, or it is a treeless to become stiffer, no matter what, but that, from my concept and from the way I look at things, is that it has to be measured. You cannot do any of this without measurable outcomes, because if you don't, for example, measure a rider's flexibility, or measure a horse's range of movement, or measure a horse's kind of muscle density, or measure the rider's core stability in some way, shape, or form, and you don't have a measurable expectation, you cannot adjust the product. Otherwise, that's just licking your finger and sticking your finger in the air. It's just, it creates further problems, because the difficulty is that numbers, especially from my perspective, numbers can't lie. Many a times I've gone to a saddle fitting process and people say, right, okay, what have you done for the last 2-3 months? Oh, I've been doing loads, but the horse's back has dropped and the horse is not looking particularly great, and so on and so forth. And you're sat there kind of going, okay, really? Have you? Well, I've been doing that in the last 3 weeks, but I mean, over the last 3 months, what have you been doing? I went on holiday, and then I lost my job, and then I've been running around. I haven't had enough time, blah, 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 blah. But now I've got a job and I've got everything, and I'm back being positive, and I've got 3 months. I've been working on it for the last 3 weeks. And you sit there and go, right, well, actually, now we've actually got to take a step backwards because you've lost all that muscle mass in the horse. And that's not a criticism. It's just the way life works. And now you're building it back up. That's fantastic. But we've just got to take a step back. We've just got to take a step backwards to then step forwards.
So who's actually going to do this evaluation? Is it up to the rider to be aware of the effects of
in my personal view, no, it's not. It's not the rider to do.
Should it be the fitter then?
It should be the fitter. No, it should be the fitter, because the fitter, if you do a measuring process which is objective, and there is no opinion in it. For example, you can measure somebody's flexibility by doing a hamstring stretch. You can measure somebody's core stability by doing a balance test. You can measure somebody's core stability by doing planks. You can do all of that type of stuff. And they're objective. There's literally a scale in personal training when people do planks and to see how strong they are. Quite literally, you've already got a scale set up within another industry.
No, we are using that setup already. So we have just implemented all those tests into courses coming out in January, so that riders can become aware of the different parts of the body using what's in the industry. But there is a problem here because the rider doesn't, the fitter isn't psychic, and the rider doesn't necessarily call you out, because sometimes they're 3, 4, 5, 6 hours away from you, and it's going to cost money and this and that. So I have come to the conclusion where I actually go head to head with the fitters in UK also, and saying that I do want to make the rider more responsible, more able, more aware, and actually even able to make a measurement and to keep track of how it feels when they put the saddle underneath the horse, and they're able to look at 3 spots on their horse, so that they know when to call me. Because if I cannot, do that, it would be like what Radley has said, for 3 months, they said, normally you don't come back out before 6 or 8 or 12 months. Sometimes people come back after 3 years. And then, they want to blame the fitter, but because the horse changed and the fitter didn't know and didn't call them and say, can I come see your horse? Because I know it had colic, and then it went into the field, and now it's been back in training, and you twisted your ankle and you're hanging on the right side. When you have horses, anything happens in a day. So to me, it's like we need not just to bring the fitters up to par with this in the industry, we also need to bring the riders with us and kind of empower them to see a few things.
So
I agree with that to a degree, but then I also disagree with that as well.
That's okay.
Respectively, the reason being is because what you in an ideal theoretical situation, you want a community around that rider. You want a talking community around that rider. Where
I want the talking saddle that calls me when things go wrong.
What I mean is that in the idealized perfect way, your farrier is talking to your saddle fitter, your fitter is talking to your coach is talking to your nutritionist is talking to blah 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 blah. Now that is in perfection. That is God's green earth. But the difficulty is that the actual reality of that is it doesn't work because everyone's far too busy. Everyone's got too many things on their plate, and they're trying to do too many things. Now, I look at it from the perspective of actually, no, this is the fitter's responsibility, and actually, it is the requirement for the fitter to prescribe what we call a service plan, and this is what we do. We turn around to customers and we say to our customers, we know that certain materials within our product have a shelf life. That is not a over with the product. That is just the way materials work. Materials
like
over a period of time, they degrade. That is natural. The more you use it, the more it degrades. It's like driving a car. The more you drive a car, the more the tires are going to wear out. Otherwise, if you don't drive your car, you've got good tires for the next 3 years. It's the same thing for a saddle in terms of padding. So we turn around to customers and we go, actually, no, here's a service plan. Here is a service plan, and this is why then your fitter has the responsibility to keep coming back, to keep taking the measurements, to look after you. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, in my view, riders have too much, and what you almost need to do is divvy up the load and the force, and everyone to take a smaller percentage of responsibility, rather than the fitter taking on all of the responsibility. You want, for example, the coach to take on a little bit of responsibility in terms of the training. Are you in a hypertrophy phase of training, or are you in cardiovascular phase of training? Are you in strength training, or are you in skills training? You know, so on and so forth. And then that, in theory, should also then filter down to the fitter, and kind of taking those measurements to kind of go, right, okay, which phase are you in? Are you in a hypertrophy phase of training? Are you in a cardiovascular strength training? Because that has an influence upon your core stability.
In reality, they're nowhere in those. In reality, they are in some kind of rehabilitation, recuperating from a few problems.
And that's why I say is actually it falls onto the responsibility of in my view, the fitter more, because the rider is more likely to forget. Ultimately, it's a lot of riders. They want to be held, and I don't mean that in a weird way, but I mean they want to be supported, they want to be looked after, they want to know that they have somebody behind them and supports and has got their back. And that's where the industry is lacking. Is fundamentally, you look at the industry and you go, well, okay, where's anybody got my back? Who's got me? Who's going to help me through this period? And in the guise of a saddle, and I'm just talking about a saddle here, then that is the role of the fitter. That shouldn't, in my view, necessarily fall onto the responsibility of the customer to kind of go, right, I've got to do my core stability training and core stability measurements to then email or text over to my fitter. If you want to do that and you want a customer who's more actively involved, then that's brilliant. But if you have a customer who's quite passive, then they might need kind of more support. You know, people come into horse riding for a variety of different reasons. You know, a lot of the ideology, we're looking at performance riders, but some people just come into riding because they love horses, and that's their therapy. In which case you sit there and go, and when the horse goes wrong, that's when you actually want to sit there and kind of give them a hug and go, right, we've got this. Don't worry about it. We've got this, and we're going to build. The reality,
if you look at it again, because we've been doing that for 15 years, and we've been offering people the service, the long-term service. They've even had service books and so forth. And what you find is that the quite professional riders are going to use this, and they're going to have you out, and they're going to make the appointment, and the horse is going to be lined up when you come to the stable. And then the unprofessional riders, they're going to have a little bit of a problem with doing that booking and keeping on top of that. And then the riders who, like you say, have just come into the industry and don't know that much, like you say, they're going to tend to forget that that you need to look at the saddle, because they don't even know if they have a plastic tree or a stuffing or a foam. They don't know. They just want it to work. So I think that this is where the industry and the fitters kind of need to get together on how are we going to deal with the fact that riders are so different. And sometimes they expect too little. Sometimes they expect too much. But in UK, you have quite short distances. In some of our countries, we have people that travel 3, 4, 5, 6 hours to a fitter. And then the cost suddenly comes in, because the fitter can't go there to see that rider for just a checkup. So we've started to try to actually do some visual checkups first, and then we get on video with them, and we teach the rider to actually measure the horse, to follow the trajectory. And what we found is that after they've done that first scary thing of actually just putting a measure on the horse, they go, oh, I can see, because then we say do it before and after riding, and suddenly they discover things about their horse and they become involved. And as soon as they become involved, they also start respecting what the rider is, the fitter is saying to them, and they also start communicating more. So I think we have to stop letting the riders be passive and involve them, have them expect more and also do more.
But I will also add into that as well, because what you're very much focusing on the rider and the fitter, and I'm talking about the manufacturer and the fitter. I am not talking. That's why I agree with you on what you're trying to achieve, but I am doing it from a very different perspective in terms of the manufacturer should take some responsibility in all of this. The manufacturer should be having conversations with the customer and the fitter by turning around and saying certain materials by this period of time, if the rider is riding a certain period of time a week, we know that materials are now going to start fatiguing about this period of time. Get in touch with your customer. And that's what I mean is you very much are looking at it from the customer and the fitter kind of angle. I'm looking at it from, okay, the manufacturer needs to take some responsibility here, because also the manufacturer is involved in the process. I'm not trying to dump it all onto the fitter, but what I'm saying is actually the manufacturer needs to take some responsibility here as well. Because
here we have a problem with the industry, because they don't know the customer. They basically just push the product onto the fitters today, and then fitters. This is a problem.
Exactly. That's what I mean. And that goes into the bigger thing is, but that's what I'm saying is, the poor saddle fitter is stuck in the middle here.
Yes, that sandwich.
So the problem is that the fitter is trying to do everything, and as I say, I understand trying to get the rider to do a lot, but I equally have got to say that the manufacturer should, you look at the car industry, the Nissan or Audi or any of those larger car companies, they also have conversations with their end consumer. They do, and they're not just talking to their sales team, they are talking to the consumer. And that's,
how many times I've told French manufacturers or Italian manufacturers that Toyota actually has service stations in the country where they sell the car.
So going back to rigid and treeless, obviously I think we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole.
So it's important for the fitters to understand that they are being squashed by an industry that is actually just unloading product onto them and then leaving it in their lap to fix all the problems.
So whether the choice is rigid or flexible or whatever, whoever is supplying that saddle or whoever obtains that saddle, i.e. the rider, if they say, oh no, it's flexible, doesn't need a fitter, they must understand how that product works, as you say, the shelf life of it, the materials it's made of. So they have to understand
what you're inadvertently creating is a situation where a customer almost has to become the expert. And
if they're going to miss out the fitter,
but this is where I struggle, is because you are expecting a customer to then become an expert within a very niche field to understand, okay, what type of tree have I got? What kind of materials are within the panel? What type of leather is it? How long have I had the material? And this is where I'm going to bang a bit of a drum. Is you sit there and go, if you had standardization within the industry and standardization within products, and if you had, for example, a NCAP safety rating system for a product or for products within the industry, you could put that on some form of scale, 0 to 100 for whatever you want to describe. And all of a sudden you can sit there and as a manufacturer, as a customer, everything like that, you can understand your scale. Like what we have in the UK is an energy rating for the houses. You imagine something like that, like a scale for saddles in terms of stiffness and flexibility.
That's what we did last time.
But a lot of like bareback saddles for, I'm not going to say flexible. A lot of those are not made in this country. Very few flexible saddles are made in the UK. So, you know, if they're
Very,
coming
very
in,
few rigid saddles are made in the UK.
ooh,
it's
that's a whole,
it's a lot of them. A lot
yeah,
of them are put together in the UK,
okay.
but they are made in India, Pakistan, Vietnam.
So
China.
can we expect those standards? So if they're made
Well,
over,
that's where you come down to the
manufacturer.
organisation, and if you
Okay.
had a organisation or a body which wants to some degree govern the industry, then if that organisation wants to create some form of standardization, and you know, it's ultimately at the end of the day, you're talking about trying to protect horses, protect riders, protect the industry, protect fitters, and protect manufacturers. You're trying to protect those people. So at the end of the day, you sit there and go, some form of standardization is going to be beneficial for everybody.
Can I
because
throw in an idea here? There is a beta trade show. Every year there's a beta trade show in UK. If everyone who's a fitter and is listening to this, why don't we just all suggest to beta that there should be a conference at the show for the industry and for the participants in the industry to come in and discuss this, because something needs to happen. A beta show where everyone visits or would visit if there was some kind of meeting and some kind of start to do this, because nothing is being done. And why are we not using that kind of venue to share knowledge, to have a conference, to have speakers, and to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, I'm always keen on stuff like that. You know, it's just all you need to do is just put a line in the ground. And you know, I've written enough documents to actually do the pros and cons of it all. Every single document I pretty much look at or write, you always end up at the same conclusion. It is going to be beneficial for the industry on a variety of different ways. As I said, you know, if you create some form of standardization in terms of product, it doesn't have to be a lot. You can start off really basic. You're not trying to make perfect straight away. You can just go right, impact testing. That's it. You can get a mechanical millie. Everybody just get some form of impact testing. You know, they do it on mattresses. You can just borrow the machine, bang, bang, bang. That's your value. Okay, we'll work within that. Everyone's safe. Everyone's okay, right? And then you can build on top of that.
I agree. I think that is step one.
Standardization. You then create that means that products which are below par, the customers then they have to buy new products. It also then means that manufacturers have a minimum standard of manufacture, so they know what materials can put in as a base minimum. So it cheapens the cost of manufacture. If you then do that and you then create competition, because then people are like, well, actually our product is better than yours, and actually next year's edition is going to be even better than the one before. So you start creating this kind of level of competition. So ultimately customers win. What you also create then is you can charge people, you can charge manufacturers a cost to do the testing, and the further more detailed testing, you can charge them more, which then means that their safety rating goes up and up and up. There's a multiplicity of ways this could massively benefit the industry, from not only horses and riders, but fitters to suddenly manufacturers, because everything, you're reducing costs, but you're also, because you know what you're building to. You'll know what minimum standard it is. It's a win-win for everybody.
And you know, like us who are trying to create new products and also to invent new ways of making the products, we need to go out there and say, okay, what densities do we have here? What densities do we need? You know, where's the library that can help us to choose? You know, instead of choosing from 100, how can we come down to testing maybe 15?
Yes, there's some approved products. I have to ask some audience questions. We've got 5 minutes left.
I've still got all the pictures to go through yet.
I know, we want to see them. Okay, so quick questions, quick answers. I spoke recently with a saddle designer maker and showed them your short video of the mobile wither part, and their question was, how would a saddle tree like that stay where it needs to be? Bradley, 10 seconds.
Oh, hang on. What component are they talking about?
The mobile wither part of.
So are they talking about the flexible gullet bar, or are they talking
I think
about
it was
the tree? Are they talking about
the points? Let's say it's the flexible.
Okay, so the flexible points. Okay, right.
Points,
so the flexible points, that is also. So the problem is you can have a flexible point. If you have a flexible point, you also then had to have a structured gullet bar. So this is where, for example, I talk about it later on, is that you're always trying to find that balance. You can have the flexible point, what we have is a finger design, which basically flares and works like a fan. But in order to have that, you then have to create stiffness or stability in another area, in another zone. So you can't just have a tree which is all wobbly and all over the place. That is illogical. So you give with one hand, you take with another. So it's very much, you're always giving and taking. Okay, what am I going to give you? What am I going to kind of have to take away to counterbalance those scales? Because you're always trying to find that balance.
Okay. And
they were thinking of putting it 2 fingers behind. Bradley's thinking of actually putting it more forward, so he can then stiffen it up where they would have made their stiff anyway.
Yeah. Good answers. And come on, be controversial. We're getting there. Hold on. And so agree with you about research with saddles. We said that about half an hour ago, what we were talking about. And an altruistic thought, but where does shared research end and intellectual property begin? That's not really rigid and flexible saddles, but yeah, that's a whole other argument.
It depends what you allow as a designer.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot is, and there is a risk of getting ripped off. And why should somebody spend years creating something for someone else to just take it? But that happens a lot, We're
experiencing
a lot of us
right now.
a lot of us out there are copied, and we can see copies of our work day after day after day, some of us. And it's very interesting when you talk about your own experience and comparison of different materials and configurations. Don't think that needs an answer. But yes, it is. We do need to really get to grips with what is in those panels. And what do you think about using a treeless saddle as a solution for a horse with a short back? This depends on rider load as well. Without going to, well, this is a genuine rigid versus treeless or flexible. So is there, if the horse has a short back, is the flexible saddle more suitable or appropriately suitable rather than for a long horsed back?
No, but it comes back to design. You see, it's like Bradley said last time, the length of the saddle is basically a non-measure. So what is really interesting is the length from the shoulder blade to where you put the rider.
Yeah.
Because you want the rider to be as far as forward as possible on that short back. And then you look at behind that, how long does the saddle need to be really to be under that rider's butt? And if you have the rider sitting up and not rolling back, that's normally no more than, they don't need more than 20 centimeters. Okay. So you can actually, by design, basically do what we do. You sweep the back of the tree up and you sweep the panels up. You don't put them 5, 6, 7 centimeters further back to balance the tree, because you don't need to if you balance the seat forward. So it's all, in how you actually web a tree, where you put the widest part of the tree, how far behind the front you put the widest part of the tree, and the shape of the tree. So the problem they're having is that 90% of the treed saddles they're seeing in the UK have the widest part much too far behind the front of the tree. And that means that as the horse moves, it lifts the tree in the rear end.
Okay, we'll have a film of that. We'll have a film of that from you, Maria. Definitely.
Have a film of that from me as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Let me keep going. And can we use a treeless saddle for a horse with atrophy or bad developed top line? It's a no from me. Get off it. I will just very quickly say that if the treeless saddle allows the horse more mobility, then you can get more muscle because of the mobility. But that, I think that's what you were getting at there. But I would say in theory, yes, but then why is the horse atrophied? You'd have to sort that out. So anyone else want to say 3 words about that before I move to the next one?
Well, it ain't going to be 3 words from me, so it'll be a lot longer. But it's roughly yes, but roughly no, because you can use a treeless saddle, but you've got to look at the training program. You've got to look at the weight of the rider. You've got to look at all of that type of stuff. We're doing some very crazy stuff behind closed doors, what we're doing, which is controversial by the industry standards, but it works. And it works temporarily. You know, we've got to get out of this mindset is that one rule fixes all. And you sit there and go, no, you can break the rules, albeit for a transitory period of time, and then come back into normal realms. So you could use a treeless saddle with a horse with atrophy or bad development top line, but what are you going to do to counteract certain elements to it, you know, for example? And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's how long are you doing it for? Are you expecting the treeless saddle to work with a horse which is atrophied and has poor top line, and then you expect the same product to work when the horse is fully muscular and developed and everything like that? It's a no-brainer that you have to sit there and go, products need to evolve and they need to change as the horse and the rider evolves and changes. So you've got to look at this as a not a product for life, and that is the fundamental element. Is we are looking at products, and quite rightly so, because we spend so much money on these things, and that's a hilarious part when you look at it. We spend in our research, the saddle is the 2nd/3rd most expensive singular product you are going to buy in equestrianism. So therefore, it is, you know, after the horse and potentially after a transport, the saddle. You sit there and go, if you're not buying transport, then it's the saddle. So, but either or, you sit there and go, it's the 2nd or 3rd most expensive product you're going to buy. You know, you're looking at, you know, a couple of, from anything from a couple of hundred to a couple of, you know, tens of grand. You know, it's there's a lot of money to be spent, and it's not proportional in terms of how much money you spend is a better product.
No, it's the economics of this is a big factor. We covered that slightly last week. Just moving on very quickly, what riders are you actually aiming this ideal world at? I think that comes from 7:45, so 3/4 of an hour ago. What riders? Well, as you've said, there's a variety of riders. We're trying to help all riders by making sure the panels do the job that you think they're doing. So protection for rider, protection for horse. How realistic is this for the enthusiastic grassroots rider? Well, I think it's very realistic, because it's all knowledge and it all needs to be out there. Like you say, a bank of knowledge. Anyone want to add to that? A couple of words?
Nope, not really.
Rhetorical questions. Oh, and can we let Bradley continue with his presentation, please?
Yes.
Sorry.
Thought, is it 1 o'clock or something? Yes, we can.
Okay, so
everybody wants questions.
No, picky time, pickies. So here we have a horse which I basically taped up with a rigid tree structure. And there's a variety of different images which I'm going to show you. So I'm going to go quickly through them and then come back through it, just so that you kind of understand what we're going to show you. So obviously here we've got a horse which is completely taped up. You can see where we've taped up from the 18th rib to the point of the shoulder. If I can use my cursor, yes, you can see my cursor. So you can see the front blue line, that is where the shoulder is. 2 inches further back is theoretically where you put the shoulder. The pink strap is the lowest point of the horse's back, so it's where the wither drops down. You've got your little blue mark where the girth would go down the bottom. You've got the 18th rib up here. And on the image on the left, you can see where a saddle would, or a treed saddle would typically kind of sit. Yes, it is butted right up to the shoulder in that picture. So you can roughly see. Now you've got this big black strap going from here. This is basically working out your angle of the least diameter, the smallest diameter or smallest circumference. This is in theory your girth strap. This is where the saddle is going to be girth strapped up to. This is where you have a plastic tree. So this is a 17-inch plastic tree. What we've done here is on the image on the right, this is where it's going to be up to the shoulder, so you can look at the front. What we've done here is we've basically put the saddle into thirds, or the tree into thirds. So you can see you've got the front third, middle third, which is the pink, and then the white at the back, which is again your third part. If we put the tree and the point up against the shoulder, the middle, literally the middle part of the tree, or the center of the tree, suddenly sits in the center or the lowest part of the horse's back. If you look on the image on the left, if you bring that tree 2 inches further back, hey ho, you're now where you're positioning the rider is now behind the lowest point of the horse's back. Again, we've done the same thing with a wooden tree. This is a 17.5 tree. So this is actually slightly half an inch longer. Again, we've done the same thing. You can now see in the middle image a view from the side. If the tree is positioned 2 inches further back behind the shoulder, you can see where the center of the tree sits slightly further back than the black line in the middle. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm not. That's not for me to say. The thing is that different disciplines such as jumping, dressage, polo, so on and so forth, they actually want the rider to be in different places to a degree. And you're talking positions of centimeters. You know, if you want the rider to be, or a show jumper to be in a slightly different position than you do for dressage. So it's not saying that one is better than the other. It's just observation. We are just looking at this from an observational perspective. But notice how the middle third, you are now positioned slightly further back than the wither. Now that's not a problem. Slightly further back than the lowest point of the wither. That's not a problem, but it's just worthwhile noting. Here, I've just made it a little bit more obvious because I've just put a black line along the tree. And I apologize for the images. These are taken when I was standing and the horse moved. So I apologize. But you can see how the center line, it just makes it a little bit more obvious how the center line, when the tree is positioned 2 inches further back from the shoulder, it moves back away from the central, from the lowest point of the horse's back. Whilst when it's butted up to the shoulder, the center line is suddenly at the lowest point of the horse's back. Here we have a saddle cut in half. This is a good tool which I use to teach because it helps people understand kind of what they see on the outside, which is all the leather and the padding and everything like that. It looks all lovely and sexy and everything. And then you strip it back and you kind of go, look at it, because it's got, you know, leather and wood and webbing and all of that fun gumph. So what you actually see on one side is the beautiful like skirt and kind of very lovely and sexy and highly polished leather, but then actually looking at the skeleton of it. Now, this is the one thing which I always say is you know, especially in saddle fitting, the way we fit modern saddles, model treed saddles, is if you're pushing the tree 2 inches further back, you know, such as what we have here, you can see where the point is right on the 2 inch mark. All of a sudden, you can see where the girth mark is, where the girth strap is, and where the girth goes. You have to have a point strap. So if you have an industry which says, right, you've got to pull the tree 2 inches further back, you're girth strapping, and then you're trying to move the girth strapping further back, then no wonder saddles are going to keep sliding forward, because they're always going to go through the smallest diameter. So almost that if you push the saddle further back, you almost have to have a point strap to counterbalance. And yes, it's negative in terms of it pulls the points down and it impacts the rotation of the shoulder. But from a purely physics perspective, you have to have a point strap because that is the smallest diameter. Otherwise, the saddle is just going to slip forward. Here we have the image again. You know, the difficulty is I've had to girth it all up, and The problem is it does tilt and fall to one side because there is nothing supporting it on that right hand side because it is literally being cut down the middle. So all you can see, and I apologize that there is a bit of a tilt. I would be doing you a disservice if I padded it up and everything like that, but it's just worthwhile noting to see how the saddle would fit on here. If it was level, you know, it's going straight down the center. You can see again, this is a much more obvious picture. I've got the pink line this time, which is showing the lowest point. And this is again where the middle third is always the interesting part. This is where the rider is sitting, always. So if the tree is now butted further forward, you can see where the girth strap and the girth now is a lot more upright. Yes, that's going to impact the shoulder and the elbow and so on and so forth. That has other implications as well, which we need to be aware of. But you can see this you're in this fundamental issue between the saddle wants to move forward in order to basically sit within the pocket behind the shoulder blade, but we want the shoulder blade to have free range and free movement. So all of a sudden you look at the girth strapping, it's no longer as angled as it was in the previous one. Here we go. So you can see how there's quite an acute angle going on in the girth strap because the saddle has been pushed further back in comparison to a tree which is now positioned on top of the shoulder. Yes, now you've lost a huge amount of space behind as well. But if you're looking at the front, all of a sudden there's less of an angle and less of a strain. So the saddle's going to stop moving forward. And this is where you start looking at history. You know, modern European saddles are naturally a lot smaller. And you've got to remember, Western saddles and kind of ancient saddles, they had smaller seats for the rider, but they had much longer panels than everybody else. I don't know where everybody's gone.
Sorry.
I'll carry on talking. Sorry.
Everyone
just disappeared all of a sudden. I was like,
I was making a picture bigger so we could see.
Oh, right. Okay.
Did you look at trees from UK, or have you looked at what I call any Latin trees?
No, so these are trees which I've bought from UK manufacturers.
Okay, because they differ a lot.
There is an inherent bias going on anyway, because obviously we're using British trees and British things. So, you know, I will hands open. I will say, you know, this is a British tree. This is not a Latino.
Yeah, because I've been looking at. I tend to divide them into the German.
Yeah,
to the British and to the Latin trees, and there is an interesting difference between them.
Yeah.
So a lot of the British trees will, for some reason, it must have had something to do with how the horses used to look, but they will tend to be quite narrow underneath the stirrup bar.
Yeah.
And extremely flat then through the rails over the back of the horse.
Yes.
And then we come to the German trees, and they are absolutely opposite. So they are extremely open in the front, and then very narrow, actually towards the back of the horse, pressing the panels together often. So that they have, and the Latin trees tend to be shorter. They don't have this long rail to where the widest part is, and they've gone. A lot of them are too narrow, too A-framed.
Yeah.
So there is no room for anything but slim 1.5 centimeter panel. But they don't put the rider so much further back. They have a more forward seat, the way they're webbed and the way because of the curved railing.
Exactly.
So they have a medium railing over the spine or the back of the horse that tends to actually fit more horses much easier.
Yeah. This is a like English tree manufacturer who I've got. So I will say that it is an English tree manufacturer. But as you can see here, what we've done is we've basically got the same tree and we've put the tree on top of the tree I cut in half, just to give you again an understanding of where, because it's much easier to visually use the pink to as a locator. So you can see on the picture on the left, if we're doing the points onto the or behind the shoulder, or 2 inches behind the shoulder, the zone where the rider sits is now positioned behind the lowest point of the horse's back. If you put it further forward, then all of a sudden the middle of the tree is where the rider is optimally going to sit is now in here. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I must keep kind of saying this. It is understanding the observations and the repercussions of what we do. That is a really important part.
Before you show your videos, I just
Absolutely.
want to say that everything you've explained there, it's made it very clear to me and possibly to others that the advantage of a flexible tree, a bareback pad, whatever you want to call it, is that you've got the potential to put the rider where they optimally should be, whereas with a rigid, just by moving it back and forwards, bear with me a minute, Maria.
No, you can't move it back and forwards because it also has a shape. So it's also going to stop according to the forces. It's going to stop, the rider, the saddle is going to move to where the rider is, and sometimes it's going to slide over the front. You have a lot of no treed saddles where the rider is far too far back by design. So it has to do with how you shape the seat. So if you shape the seat so it's flat further back, the rider is going to slide back very easily.
But if you've got like a pad type design, just a very rudimentary pad type design, so then it's like you say,
bareback, there's just a pad. Then you may actually sit where the horse is going to put you, which will be in the right spot.
So the seat is important. Yeah. Okay.
Very important.
But whereas with a rigid tree, the low point of the saddle, etc., that's kind of fixed.
Yeah, by the design. As a designer, if I buy a tree and I decide, how I want it, I can then web the tree.
Yeah.
And I can decide where that lowest point is going to be.
Right.
So I can web it more forward, or I can web it more backwards. I can web it wider. I can web it narrower. So it becomes, what I think as a designer, what I know about how the rider will move in the saddle. Because if you, like today with most of those saddles you're seeing, if it's too narrow, the rider will seek somewhere to put their seat bones, so they will go back until the seat bone have something to sit on. And if it's too wide, the legs will go forward and the rider will roll backwards. So the seat design is huge for.
So there's a lack of support in the seat, which will interfere with the this is
very three-dimensional.
Good knowledge.
And then I do something completely different.
Yeah. So somebody says here,
because essentially I'm a hybrid designer, so I'm trying to do what Caroline's asking in terms of trying to position the rider in one place, and I'm doing exactly what Maria's talking about, which is the adjustability of the tree for the horse. And because mine is a two-part design, they work independently. I have that ability to do that. So I'm always trying to locate the rider in exactly the same place, depending on what they're trying to do, dressage, jumping, polo, so on and so forth. And I have the luxury of being able to adjust a product dependent on the horse's shape as well. So all of a sudden, you suddenly look at hybrids sitting in the middle, and that's where I say is that you've got to look at. I use a phenomenal amount of anatomy and observation to understand what I'm trying to achieve. For example, if you were to sit, and I quite happily, people get irate when I say this, but if you measure from the lowest point of the horse's wither, so the dippiest bit, the lowest part, and you measure along the ribs where the panel is going to be to where the 18th rib, okay, and people get irate because they talk about T18. I'm not interested in T18 because I'm interested where the panel goes, not interested about T18 because the tree and the panel goes nowhere near T18. The panel sits on the rib line. That's what I'm interested in.
Okay.
So measure from the lowest point along the horse's back to rib 18, and within a certain demographic of horses, i.e. horses which are generally below 14 hands, generally above 14 hands, it's not below, don't do it below, but above 14 hands, you have this quirk in anatomy where they're all consistent. You're looking from any range of 28.5 to 31 centimeters, and you're looking at that range. Basically, that's how much variance there is. And now when you look at anatomy and you start stripping back anatomy, and you say, and this is the irony, is I find it hilarious when people talk about short backs and long backs. I sit there and go, okay, where is the short back? Where is the long back? Where is your concept of a short back and a concept of a long back? Because I will tell you now, the rib width of a horse in 14 hands and the rib width to an 18-hand horse, at maximum, you're talking about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters difference per rib. Over 18 ribs, you are either talking 1.8 centimeters or 3.6 centimeters.
It's actually the same with the other measurement, because we've been measuring from the shoulder to the deepest point, just like you've been measuring, and that will move as if the horse lifts up or if it's sunken down.
Exactly, that changes, but we take the measurements slightly different. I don't know where you're taking your measurements from the shoulder, but we take our measurements along the horse's spine in terms of that wither measurement, that wither length. We take that measurement.
Yeah. But the interesting here is that they stay the same as well. If the horse is healthy, you will have in a normal horse a distance that is 21 centimeters. If they're really, really long in that area, they might be 22. If they're really small pony, it might be 17.
But
so
again, what's
very small variancy.
What's interesting is you're very much, like what the industry does. The industry is always looking, from my perspective, as an observational anatomy perspective, we're all looking at the shoulders, we're all looking at the front. And what I find fascinating is that is a highly mobile area. There is no grounded marker. Within any horse, the wither angle changes, the lowest point changes in terms of length, in terms of angles, everything like that. From my perspective, rib 18 is your locator. That is, okay, rib 18, rib 17, depending on whether horses have a rib 18 or they don't. Some horses don't have an 18th rib, but you're always looking at the last rib. That last rib is your fixed, from my perspective, a fixed marker, because everything else in terms of shoulders and so on and so forth, that is affected by such things as hoof angles. That's the things affected by leg length, whether the horse has had splints or it's had damage, in terms of muscular development, in terms of atrophy, in terms of all of that. But the consistent thing we have is from the 18th rib to the lowest point in the horse's back.
Yeah,
that is always consistent.
Yeah, and why I don't really care about that back end is because I'm always looking to place the rider where the pink is, and that spot will move maybe 1 or 2 centimeters as the horse lifts up, and it will also
where does it move? Does it move forward or backwards?
Upwards.
Upwards. So
it goes upwards,
backwards.
But it goes upwards, but because of the back curve, when the horse's back goes up, there's going to be basically a leaning, an elevation. It's going to get longer. Okay.
Yes, it gets longer.
This is where it's slightly different, because we look at things very differently, but we're trying to achieve the same thing. If I go from the 18th rib to the pink zone, okay, that is for me, a standard, predictable kind of area, 28.5 to 31 centimeters.
But that means you want to use that area. You want to use that area.
Hang on. If I know that length is always roughly the same, and you have a variance of 2.5 centimeters, all of a sudden, I can locate the rider with a much greater sense of accuracy, and I don't have to worry about the front. I don't have to worry about it, because I can use the last rib, as my fixed locator to locate where the rider is. When the horse's back elevates and the horse's back then lengthens, depending on the degree of elevation as well, because that's also a factor. That's why you have to work out the drop angle, and you have to work out the elevation angle.
Yes.
But if you know that the horse's spine drop is 5 centimeters and it's along a 30 centimeter length, that becomes predictable, because then it elevates to 3 degrees or 2 degrees.
Yep.
Then I can work out the degree of elevation and degree of lift. I can work it all out. That's all maths. That's just trigonometry. So all of a sudden I can work out how much that pink zone has opened up by, because it's just maths. It is that simple.
It's opening up, and at the same time, as long as the horse is dropping that area, which is where we are meeting riders today, most of the riders we are meeting, they're riding a horse that is dropping the pink area, and it's making the front of the horse seem really short.
Yep.
And that's causing them some problems. So yes,
but this is
you want them to have them over 11, 12. You know, if you want them over 11, 12, you know, like I know that as it lifts, it's going to create a gap in the front. And that gap, then you have to figure out what's actually happening underneath the stirrup bar with the shape, because the saddle should not really be carried on the 3-point. It should be carried in that pink area, because that's where the rider is.
This is why I say is that if you have a design and a fitting concept which is so obsessed around the shoulder and 2 inches off the shoulder, then by its very nature, and I'm not saying you, Maria, I'm saying the industry as an entirety, we are as an industry hyper focused on the shoulder to try and avoid load and pressure on it. Then inherently, if you have an industry which is focused about trying to position the saddle further off the shoulder, and you are not working with fixed locatals, okay, so we have fixed locations, then all of a sudden it becomes you're trying to hit a target, a moving target, which is moving side to side, left to right, up and down. You're never going to hit that target in exactly the same place every time.
No, and the problem you're seeing in the English trees is that if you measure them from that, front of the tree to where they actually place the rider, most of them are 24, 25 centimeters. There's no horse that measures 24 or 25 centimeters from the pink area to the blue area, even if it does have a long wither and lifts up a lot.
And that is, again, that goes back to tree design, because tree design is obsessed about, and the way trees, and I don't, obviously we'll have to explain this. In the industry, in terms of a wooden tree or whatever, when they lengthen or shorten the tree, they don't do it at one end. They do it in the middle. So the problem is that the way you change a 15-inch tree to a 17-inch tree, or so on and so forth, is quite literally the molds. They have just lengthened in the middle. So that then changes the center point and the balance point of the tree, and it changes the balance point of the tree on top of the horse.
Depending on how you web it.
Depending on how you web it and various things like that. But this is where you suddenly sit back and you go, well, the actual aspect of tree design and tree manufacture is flawed, because what they're trying to do is they're lengthening and shortening the middle bit, when actually you need to be looking at, okay, where are your fixed locators?
And if you don't even know the natural, if they don't even know the natural horse, what kind of distances it has, how it may vary from withers down and how sharp the withers come and what shape it has to withers up. If you don't have that calculated into how you make the trees, then it just becomes very, very, very hard to build saddles onto those trees and then actually have the saddles fit anything.
Exactly.
Some of the best fitters I know in UK, they are like, oh, I really only have a handful of saddles that I can say that I can fit to a couple of different kinds of horses. They are troubled.
So this is what I mean, is you sit there and go, this is why I giggle when people say, oh, it's a short-backed horse. What do you mean by a short-backed horse? Do you mean literally the lumbar spine? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about the ribs? Are you actually saying the horse is structurally shorter over the rib zone? Because you do not get much variation in rib width. It's like me. If I sit down on a chair, I'm 6'5". I'm big, I'm tall. But if I sit down in a chair next to my wife, who is 5'8", 5'9". We're not too dissimilar in body height.
No, it's the
But
pelvis.
as soon as I stand up, most of my height is in my legs.
Yeah.
That's why I was a very good athlete and various things like that. But, and this is what I mean, is when you start, you might have a horse which is really long, but you've got to understand where is that length coming from. And
it's the withers that most people, that makes the back look short.
That's why I say is you've got to understand the anatomy, because where is the length coming from? You can get a 2-inch increase or an inch increase in length by adding 1 millimeter to every rib, or 2 millimeters to every rib. You know, you're only they've got 18 ribs. You literally add 1 millimeter to every single one. You've got 2 centimeter length improvement, but it's 1 millimeter on every. So this is where it's interesting, because you're sat there going, okay, where is the length coming from? And horses in a 15-hand horse, when you actually measure the width of a 15-hand horse cadaver, and I've done this on dead horses, to an 18-hand, you know, Suffolk Punch, who unfortunately died, and I got to measure their widths. Okay. You are literally talking a 15-hand to an 18-hand plus. There was a millimeter difference per rib.
Which means it comes down to longitudinal flexion, Caroline?
That's what I mean. Is you start looking, you got to look at the cumulative length. You're not looking at this singular concept of, okay, all the length is in one bit, all the length. There's quirks in anatomy. You know, if as I said, I sit down next to my wife, when you look at us comparatively, in terms of height, when we stand, there is a big difference in height. You know, what is it, 8 inches in terms of height difference. But when we sit together, and you look at us, there's only 2 or 3 inches comparable in terms of our height when we sit.
And really, the difference happens behind the 18th, because you can have a very long or a shorter lumbar spine.
This is where you start looking at, you've got to look at, you know, the anatomy. You've got to look at the angles. You've got to look at the degree of elevation. All of these things. It is this cumulative observation which you have to do. So in that, guys, you know, in terms of, this is just a video to show you a horse doing a back elevation. And all he's doing is basically his back is just coming up. Yeah. You can see how you can hear me. You can see how the ribs flare as well. So when we do that again, you've got this back elevation, and you see how he's mostly coming up in front in terms of the wither. But you can see how all the angles completely change.
Everything changes.
Absolutely. So this is why you end up having, and especially the way we do it, we take all these measurements, and then what we do is we do all of the elevations. And if we can't take the elevations, and that's the funny part, because some people have turned around and said, well, actually the horse is a bit too sensitive, we can't actually take the measurements, then what we do is we say, well, okay, we'll just we can work it out in terms of maximum, because if we know that we've got a wither or a thoracic spine angle of 5 degrees, then what we do is we can calculate what it's going to be at neutral, at 0. Because if we can work that out, that's the most extreme position a horse will ever go in. It's never going to buckle in terms of kind of go the opposite direction, because it'll only do that at the extreme ranges of jumping. It won't do that in terms of dressage. So here we have another video, but obviously with a tree on. And in the way we've positioned the tree is theoretically 2 inches behind the shoulder. Now, what I can just pull your eye to is look at the back, and this is something which Maria talked about earlier. You can see how it suddenly starts floating, and it almost has a little bit of a wobble. So you can see how it now suddenly becomes destabilized. Turn the music off. Oh, hang on. There you go. Next one. Right. So this is really doing what Maria was talking about earlier. You can really see as that back comes up, you get this lovely gapping going on. And this is a fundamental problem with Sorry, you can get to see my face at the end of it. But this is a fundamental problem with rigid tree structures, is that you do the lift, all of a sudden you get this almost rocking effect going on because the tree is not fitted to the elevated position. Now that is mitigated with a treeless saddle because obviously they are flexible, they will mold slightly. But this is one of the fundamental issues with tree saddles, and that's also the reason why.
But it's a different. There's a different part of that, and that is that a lot of these tree saddles are actually. We tested this on horses, and we tested how the horses move just by moving the pressure backwards. So, if you actually move the pressure forwards and actually come off the back end, they will move better, use the psoas better, and come in with the hind end better. But the tree has to be carried on a greater width and under the rider, so it can't tilt. But it's not really a problem of it lifting off in the rear end as long as it's stabilized in the rest of the tree.
But this is what I'm saying is when you have a treed saddle on a horse which lifts to that degree.
Yes.
That is the reasons why then a lot of manufacturers have then put back straps onto their trees in order to pull that down. So this is what I mean, is that when you are starting to look at treed and treeless saddles and this hybridization process going on, suddenly you have a treed saddle which fits when the horse is static, but then is when the horse is elevated, the tree doesn't fit. So therefore their workaround is to get a back strap down in order to make that back part, the last third of the tree, stay in contact with the horse's back. So that is an adaptation of a rigid tree structure to make it fit, to make it more flexible in theory. Then you have other compensations, as I say. So you have this hybridization process going on all the time. So you've got to understand as a fitter and also as a manufacturer and as a designer and as a customer and as all of these types of things, what is the intention behind that theory, i.e. the application of a backstrap?
Yeah, I've left the whole pressure on the back end a long time ago. We have, I think it's like 99% of the horses will lift their back better, engage better if you don't have a high pressure at the end of the panel, because they need to access their psoas. And they need to be on the stance face. And if you have something bouncing back straight down between 16, 17, and 18, not keeping the rider forward, that horse is going to hold its back. It's going to resist that.
What we found, and this is why I end up talking about lateral rib expansion in the lower ribs.
Yeah.
Because when you get elevation of the horse's back, you also get lateral expansion of the horse's rib cage. So if you are using a back strap at the same time to then pull that tree down onto it, you create a ridge, you create a pressure ridge, even though you may have padding and so on and so forth. And depending how the panels are designed in order to compensate for that. But a lot of modern jumping saddles, which is predominantly a lot of the research I was doing at the time, they don't have the padding, the softness padding going round the edge. What they do is that it's quite a hard edge and it's generally foam. So when they have the back strap to pull it down to stop it, flick it up, that creates a hard ridge against the rib line. And generally that rib line is right on the rib angle, so where it starts bending and curving down. So you've got the paraspinals, and then obviously that's where the tree sits. That created a huge amount of pressure, which is why we then basically created a theory of the lateral expansion of the rib cage. So what we call the thoracic balloon. We don't we understand the thoracic sling, but then we've applied it into a three-dimensional object, which is why we use the thoracic balloon. So we create and have created products in order to compensate for all these things. But again, it always comes back to when you are a hybrid saddle designer, you were like, okay, what am I going to give? What am I going to take back? What is this exchange which I'm always going to give? I can give you the highly flexible tree, but in order to do that, I have to create stability somewhere else or in another way, shape, or form. So as you can see, this is a final slide for this bit.
You and me are really operating between number 10 and 16. I mean,
So we kind of sit there and go, right, hybridization is the goal. That's what everybody is aiming for at the moment within the industry. You know, everybody's trying to get that sliding scale of, okay, we want balance, we want that hybrid. But the problem is I'm looking at it from another perspective. I'm kind of going, yeah, hybridization is great, but that's because I've created a product. But what I'm looking at personally is going, hybridization with specialization is the true goal for me. I'm not interested in hybrid saddles. I've made a hybrid saddle. I know how to do that. What I'm interested in is that specialization. And what I mean by that is specialization for the horse, for the rider, and for the relationship. So, you know, for example, we have a saddle which is highly flexible, but we also have components which can then make it stiffer. So we start off with a product which is highly mobile. And if you've seen some of our videos, then you'll see how much movement there is. It's wibbly wobbly. But then what we do is we then add components to it to make it stiffer. So we can actually then add things to change the not the density of the materials, but the overall density or the overall performance of the tree into a more dense product. And the reasons why we've done that, we've started from a highly flexible product to then make it more dense or more stable, is actually really simple because it's easier to manufacture that way. It's much harder to have a product which is much stiffer to then reduce, to remove, to basically make it much more pliable and flexible, because there's more likely you're going to make it inconsistently flexible. Whilst if you have a highly flexible product, you just can add more, and that is much easier to add things to stiffen up. So it's more from a manufacturer's perspective, really.
Yeah, you can basically put joints and ligaments into it.
Yeah, exactly. We can stiffen it up, and we can stiffen it up in a variety of different ways. We can either stiffen it up through the metalwork, i.e. the gullet bar. We can stiffen it up with different plastics. We can layer up plastics to make materials stiffer. We can stiffen it up with foam or materials such as leather and so on and so forth. So what you're doing is this accumulative building of a product into variations of stiffness. So it's quite fascinating when you're starting to get into the physics and the nerdy part. But as I say, everyone at the moment is all going for this hybridization, and I'm looking at it and going, well, hybridization with specialization. So, you know, if we can build a product which is starting off, which is highly stiff and rigid, and then as the horse gets stronger or weaker or anything like that, we can then change that. We can change the flexibility of the equine tree independently, without affecting the rider. That is what we're achieving, and that is what we're trying to achieve with our personal design. But
if we're talking about a fitter here, that the thing that the fitter needs to think about is that if you have a heavier rider with a little bit more poor lateral control, whatever you may start fitting them in, it may not be able to hold that rider centered.
Absolutely.
So what we're looking at here is actually stiffening up so that when the rider comes a little bit to the outside or follows that rotation or takes the horse into more rotation, the saddle will actually stop them from loading so that that area collapses too much.
Yeah.
So we're trying to limit the rotation roam of the horse. And I actually, as having a semi-rigid tree, my tree is actually so short, and the panels, the way they're a bit thicker, which kind of makes it almost like the hybrid thing, which is, like you say, it's too soft in the beginning. We also use leather and parts to say that, okay, the panel cannot do this job for this rider. We need a denser material or felt or leather to come out and give that more support so that there is not too much movement going on. And I think this is important because in the industry, some fitters will be told to take like all the stuffing out and put in new, and that makes the saddle very unstable. So in some cases, it's much better that they actually just fill a little bit of stuffing on top if it needs to be worked on, because then you keep the stability of the felted wool that you have under that's offering stability. So you always have to work with the situation.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why I say it's hybridization with specialization. Building a hybrid saddle is it's a greater or lesser degree as a generic hybrid saddle is relatively easy. You're just trying to basically get the best bits of both. But it's that specialization. It's that kind of unique element of the requirements of the horse, the rider, the relationship, the discipline, the demands, all of that type of stuff. That is the real, for me personally, is the golden zone. Is that kind of specialization component of hybrids.
Do you have another slide? Sorry, I'm not trying to move you on, but I just wondered.
I do, but the problem is that it's then, because all what I've talked about is generalities. I have only talked about generalities within the hybrid saddle area. I'm more than happy to talk about kind of Ipotane and what we do and how we do it. But I don't want that to turn into a pitch or a presentation about our product in any way, shape, or form. So I have got other slides which I'm more than happy to talk about our logic and various things like that. But I don't want it to turn into a pitch or a presentation, because that's just,
you have to do a poll with the audience.
Yeah, that's down to whether people want me to talk about that or not. If they do, brilliant. If they don't, I'm more than happy to stop it here.
We're going to have a third summit on this, because I think now that the information is sinking in, and it also we're getting towards 2.5 hours now, which I didn't want to happen.
Surprise.
I've got other questions up here. We've got question statements. Thank you. There is a lack of quality information on saddle design and more in-depth details on saddle fitting. Please do it more. Yeah. And the biggest factor I've observed that affects the stability of a saddle when I do a sternal belly lift and loin coil is the width of the channel under the stirrup bars. So I think, as you said, it just fills out. You get the rib.
You get a lateral rib flare, but what the other thing you also have to consider is the channel width, and you're quite right. Is that a wider channel in theory is going to make it more stable, but the problem is for example, if you have a flexible tree like what we have in our product line, we have a tree which flexes laterally. So all of a sudden, if you have when the tree is relaxed, it looks like there's a very narrow channel. But then when you put load on it, the tree then spreads and basically pulls outwards. So then your channel is nice and wide. Now, if you have a channel which is too wide, you're not actually loading the paraspinal muscles. You are then loading the lateral edge or the outer edge of the paraspinal muscle. So you're not distributing the load upon a muscle belly which is designed to take load. You're then putting it more onto the rib angles and everything like that. So you might want a greater channel. And I've been asked to make a channel which is 8 centimeters wide. And I sit there and go, no, because you completely miss the load bearing zone which you want to hit, because it's not a good idea. And I had to explain it to the customer. I was like, well, if you want to do that with a rigid tree, that's absolutely fine. But because of our tree, because it flares deliberately laterally in certain areas and certain zones, that is actually going to be quite negative, because when you put load and mass on our tree, the equine tree will spread outwards, because that's what it's designed to do. So suddenly your 8 centimeter gap in the channel at rest is suddenly a 10 or 11 centimeter gap when it's under load. And I showed them it, because I put the saddle on and then put a load on the tree on a fake horse on a rack.
Classic, yeah.
And she went, oh yeah, that I can see what you mean, because I know how much our tree can spread under different loads. So that we also calculate into the materials and the design. So it's really fascinating when you start looking at channel width, and especially where you're putting the channels. And it's also dependent on how the stirrup bars are attached to the tree. If you use a fixed stirrup bar, it has it's got a 2-point kind of whole mechanism. So one which is on the rails of the tree and one which is on the point. So now you've created a triangle. That's an incredibly strong material, but strong geometric shape. But the problem then is if you want to flare that, it creates problems. Whilst you can have other trees which move their stirrup bars slightly further back, they have a rail system, they have a click system to move it. So you've also got to factor in is how those stirrup bars are positioned on the tree. So Dorothy's absolutely right in terms of channel width is really important, and stirrup bar area. But stirrup bars are this is why the way I design stirrup bars is slightly different to everybody else, because I want stirrup bars nowhere near the horse. If you look at our tree design, when we have the equine tree and you see the rider tree on top, the stirrup bars for the rider are nowhere near. In fact, they're pressed into the equine tree. So I know that the weight of the stirrup bars is being taken onto the tree or the equine tree. It cannot have any direct contact with the horse. But I've had to do that, and the way to do that is because I've sacrificed other things to do it. So it's really fascinating when you're
this is important, because there are a lot of people that actually don't know that their stirrup bar, this is why I say customers actually need to learn to put their fingers up underneath where the stirrup bar sits underneath the panel to find out, because this is the most crucial point for the horse and for the rider, because there's whatever you do, whenever you post, whatever you do, horse is got to come up there. The horse is going to push up there, and you're going to be pushing down on it. That's the most crucial point where the tree has to fit in the angle, and where you cannot have the stirrup bar, coming into if the panel is too thin there.
Exactly.
And in many ways, this has been a failure of many flexible or treeless saddles, hasn't it? This stirrup bar area.
It's not only a failure of flexible trees, it's also a failure of interchangeable gullet bars and flexible gullet bars and all of those types of things, because the gullet bar has an influence and has a corresponding effect upon the stirrup bars. It has to, because we put the stirrup bars so far forward. And the reason being is because we put the stirrup bars forward in element, because it creates a wider balance point or set or area of balance for the rider. If you pull the stirrup bars further back, you're actually making the balance point for the rider very much smaller. So you have to have a higher degree of stability and control to have a smaller balance point.
Which is what I'm forcing some of these riders to have.
Yeah, exactly. And we do that as well, but we're now also looking at it. We've done it to quite an extreme proportion from a very purist and puritanical perspective, and we're now moving the stirrup bars further forward, but it's still attached to our rider tree. So I know that the stirrup bars which are going further forward, they're still positioned and located on top of the equine tree. So any downward force on the stirrup bar is being pushed into a broad application of the equine tree. At no point do our stirrup bars go near the panels or near the horse.
Stirrup bars.
But in order to do that, we have had to sacrifice other things.
The stirrup bars, I think, is a very, very important topic, because if you look at British saddles, the distance from the stirrup bar to where the rider actually sits, it's sometimes far in front of the rider's pubic bone.
Yeah.
And we did experiments, and if you're going to try to figure out where should the stirrup bar be, it needs to be, if you're not jumping very high, because then you can have a shorter stirrup bar, because you're going to stand over the pommel and go faster and higher up. And if you're very tall, you can also then have a shorter stirrup bar, because you're going to get more forward and above the horse. Anyone who is, not very tall, not very big, and trying to ride just normal, they are forced to actually press their knee inward with their thighs to hold on and to raise forward to get over their foot. So they're posting back to front, back to front, back to front.
Yep.
And this is irritating the hell out of the horses. So what we did a test with in 2004 is we brought 3 horses in that had responded very differently to 2 different saddles, and the saddles fit the horses equally. So we put a pressure mat under, and the pressure was quite equal. What differed, what the horses actually reacted to, was because we could see the rider's movement, because it made a blur in the middle, and the smaller it got, the better the horse went.
Yeah.
So this is what I went away from there, and I'm like, okay, I've done the test, and this is 2004, so nobody else has looked at this. And now I have to understand why the hell the rider was so much more stabilized in one saddle over the other. So I had to spend a few years to figure that one out. So it's really, when we're building a saddle, and we're coming back to the pink point, you cannot build a saddle that places the rider behind the pink point, and then the rider has to go in front of the pink point to reach their stirrup bar. This is the major flaw in the saddles for the riders today, and this is making the fitters fail. See, I'm tired, because they can't. The fitters can't fix this.
No, they can't. And this is my frustration, and where I get frustrated with the industry is because you sit there and go, there's a catalogue of failure on a variety of different levels. And at the end of the day, the fitters are the ones stuck dealing with all the issues, and they're having to budget. They're literally having to just do workarounds all the time to make products work. And for me, it's frustrating. And you sit there as a designer, you sit there and go, there's 6 ways you could solve this right now. Like, quite literally, I could sit down with a tree and I could design 6 different ways to make that product way more effective. Like, literally, I could do that tomorrow, and everything. I haven't, because I have created a hybrid saddle instead of doing a mono tree, because I fundamentally think being able to treat things differently and be able to work with things differently, they have different demands. So doing it in one singular product is almost impossible.
I was lucky enough to work with somebody who did sit down and think about this a little bit. Not all the way, but quite far. So I was able to pick up from where they were, which was trees that were fundamentally different from the ones that we are talking about. And then we started to look at the rider, because I think that, what joins you and me, that is that dream of having the top fit for the rider, bottom fit for the horse, and having them be independent enough. So because you can change things today for the horse, you can fiddle with things, but you can't do it for the rider. Once the saddle is made, that rider is kind of stuck with it.
Couple more questions, statements, and then we'll wind up with just a sentence from each of you. We must have another summit. Talking about the stirrup bar area, I mean the stirrup bar area of the rails panels. If the channel is wide enough here, the saddle remains stable as the horse lifts the back to the maximum. Very good point. Which
so, for example, we're looking at, when you look at panels, and this is quite fascinating. I'm going to give away a little bit of IP on this, so I apologise. I apologise to people who are going to get frustrated with me, but it's always worthwhile. I like to throw a cat amongst the pigeons. When you look at panels, the irony is if you were to flip a tree over and look at the panels, the hilarious part is that they both are similar in terms of, they're symmetrical, they're contoured. There's a little bit of a shape, there's a little bit of a curve to it, but not very much. And you actually sit there and go, well, hang on, if I'm looking at the horse's back from a side view, top and down, well, hang on, I want a panel which is actually wibbly wobbly. I don't want a panel which is smooth, because the reason being is because I'm putting different loads in different areas. So where I may want, for example, the channel to be slightly wider around the stirrup bar zone, and then actually I want it closer together in another zone. and then further apart in another zone. Do you see what I mean? So suddenly you've got this panel which is now wibbly wobbly, and not a panel which is smooth and straight and following the contour of the back. And the reasons why I say that is because that changes with the angle of the horse's wither. So as I say, I'm giving away a little bit of IP there, which we're kind of playing with, but it's quite good fun.
I think
we have played with that as well. Yeah.
The drop panel to me seems to be like a really, really terrific design there, because it just seems to have so much flocking in there that can allow for the expansion.
Are you talking about flocked as the round panel that we call it?
The drop panel, there's a lot of flocking under the tree points. There's about
so that
it's very thick, so it will bed down.
Yeah, this is what we are doing.
Makes sense.
But there's a big difference to an English panel and a round or a dropped panel. So the dropped panel came out of a French invention in Seymour, and they were trying to mimic what you once had in the military saddles. So the whole idea with it, if you look at the dropped panel, is that you have no stitching on the outside. It's not stitched to the saddle. So the point of putting it on, and if you've designed it properly, is that it will actually come outside of the tree instead of just going in line with the tree. Because if you're in line with the tree, you will have the pressure line come down. So the drop panel you can put so that it edges further out. And if it's round and you have wool in it and it's made like a tube, it will compress and roll. So you don't get an edge at it. So it will kind of behave a little bit like a swivel tree, and it will be completely independent because when you have a little bit more wool also in the middle compared to an English panel, you can then balance the saddle better in the middle instead of balancing it between the front and the rear. It's harder to balance it in the middle because you need to know what happens when the horse lifts the back. And you need a tree that it's not going to get shoved one way or another because it's the wrong shape. But if you work with a drop panel with a tree that it's designed to do, you have such an easier time to actually alleviate all the pressure underneath the rider. Because it's so much thicker and it rolls.
Great. Another couple of comments in agreement with the Stuart bar area. Base of wither needs ample room for contraction, yes. Plus, that wooden tree is not suitable for that horse. Bradley. I'd love to see more about your saddles, Bradley. That wasn't a comment from the one I just read from. And are we talking about flat length and blocks? Or is it a whole topic for more summits? There's more topics for more summits here, so we can pick up on there. Talking about doing a belly lift, for me, when the horse is moving and the horse then does or finds its wither lift, then the horizontal balance just goes like that on the saddle. It just no longer fits. So that's more of an issue for me as well. Now
there are two lifts.
Yeah.
So you can get the wither lift early first. Then you have to get the engagement from the hind to get the back lift. And that may actually be lacking 2-3 centimeters for months. So you need to, you can't just fill that up with a lot because then it's never ever going to come. It's a fine balance.
These are things that need to be observed. I just a sentence from each of us to finish with. My perspective, saddle seat design is crucial for the rider so that they can get this optimal position on the horse's back. So that's something we need to beat into people. Otherwise, it makes it difficult for them to ride in that reduced tone which we spoke about earlier. So optimal position for the rider is no point placing them not in the optimal position because they just won't be able to ride effectively at all. So
your study is showing also, I guess, a lot of back pain because if you have the posterior rotation that is most common, what happens if this is the pelvis and this is the first spinal thing, is that you get this.
Yeah.
And you have both the disc here and you have the back muscle and the quad, desperately trying to hold things together.
Yeah.
So we can't allow that role because people get completely overstrained in their backs.
Yes. And that's something about, saddle design needs to protect the rider's joint health. And this is all happening in the low back, the pelvis, the hips, the knees, the ankles. So if I could ask you, Maria, could you give us one sentence, perhaps related to rigid and flexible? We'll go up two then. Related to rigid and flexible saddles, what do we need to take away from this evening?
That is very individual. Again, you have to work with the situation. It's like Bradley says, we really need to get down to what does this horse and rider really need right now, and what are they going to need. If you have a situation that is very young or very fragile and a lot of stuff going on, you may need to see that horse in 6 to 8 weeks.
Fine.
If you have a situation that's very stable, you may not need to see that horse for 7-8 months. So it's just understanding where you are when you start and working that out with a fitter. That is this fragile? Is this is a lot going to happen, or is it going to be pretty stable?
And this was your slide, one of your slides last time, wasn't it? That we need to refer to. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Maria. And Bradley, 2 sentences. You can't breathe.
Yeah, no. To be honest, I am going to be slightly biased. We are moving away as an industry away from this polarized viewpoint of treed and treeless. We are every product is always heading towards this hybridization. Hybridization is where it really is starting to come in. That is the future of the industry. It's how you want to do the hybridization. That's what the real skill of any fitter for the next future, for the next decade, is where it's at. Is that skill set of what are you trying to hybridize? The horse, or are you trying to hybridize the rider? Are you trying to and the two are, the only way I can see that happening is in a 2-part design. I logically cannot see it happening in other ways. But I am inherently biased, in terms of that. So I will stick my hands up. Thanks. So yeah, we as the industry, we just need to move away from this aggressive polarization. It's okay. And my thing is looking at the saddle as a human body. It is built on layers and systems. It is not built on one singular thing. And that's what we need to integrate, that mindset of integration of different materials, different concepts, different thinking, and we need to be kind of widely accepted to do that, rather than just this aggressive polarization.
Is there anyone who know how the bed industry moved to where they are today? Because they used to be either it was very soggy, and today they actually know how to make the layers, just like you're saying, firmer and then softer on the top. It doesn't need to be totally soggy to feel softer.
Do you know how they did that? Do you want to know how they did that?
Yeah.
Standardization.
Yeah.
They create the bed industry created regulatory body, and it created rules and regulations. That's how it did it.
Suddenly everybody knew how to get there.
All of a sudden, the companies then became more competitive with each other, because they started to then basically make beds on performance scales, and that created greater competition. So the fundamental component, in terms of, if you're looking at the bed industry, it was standardization. The regulatory body came in and said, right, okay, and overnight, quite literally overnight, they brought in rules and regulations which suddenly the whole industry had to adhere to, and they've evolved from that, because it just created a competitiveness within the industry.
I'm glad I brought that up.
in all honesty, because I actually did research into bedding companies, because I was looking at materials and how they did it. At one point I was looking at a spring system into panels. I was looking at some really clever, far out things, really stuff which is a decade away from the saddle industry, and I'm still in conversations with bedding companies about the possibilities of that. But that's how, and I got talking to them. You know, where I live, Hypnos is just down the road. So I live near the bed company, which, you know, used to provide for the Queen.
If you want to rebalance the rider, I mean, that's where the BUA can, you know, you could actually rebalance front and rear if you want of your type of saddle.
Okay, we have to leave that for another summit.
To answer that question, it is standardization, and it is, and
but then they put their wonderful technological mattresses onto these wooden slats that are that far apart and break your back anyway.
But now with beds, that changes, because they turn around and now say, right, is it a divan? Is it a bed slat? Is it a sprung mattress? Like all of these types of things. So they now adjust the mattress depending on what type of bed frame you have. And what they're even looking at is what type of house you're in, whether it is, as in it's got a suspended floor, and so on, if you're on carpet. So they're really, you know, they're looking at some really clever stuff. But
the oversight with slats, they're instruments of the devil.
Oh yeah.
Right, so thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one, and agree with Bradley, hybrids are the future. So I think just more understanding of the horse and rider, the movement, the gait, the posture, the conditioning, the muscle development, that all needs to go in the pot of soup.
Well, that's in the nice. That's what I was going to show you. Like I was going to continue presenting and showing our way. I was going to show you all of that in terms of how we take on all of that data and actually see our scale system and all of our graphs, and literally see a horse's profile. Basically, you were going to have a little sneak peek of our equine profile, which we build up, and how that then incrementally informs us of what changes we need to make to the product. You know, we have spent so long creating a system where we get all that data. And then we basically create a personal profile of the horse, and also rider. They're two separate components.
So this is about evaluation. Can we maybe next summit, can we talk about evaluation? Because that seems to be a bit of a mystery to what information do we need? Yeah. So then we can do the rest of your slides, and we can really drill down into.
There's always loads. I'm doing loads of bloody stuff. So.
Okay. So when should we come back? Early New Year? Yes. So we'll fix a date between us.
There's a lot of stuff that happens in the very early New Year up to the 14th, I think, and then it's, I think, less.
Okay, so we've got about a month. 4 weeks. About 4 weeks time then, and we'll great. Okay, well, thanks a million. It's been absolutely amazing, and we've got Brill, thank you, part 3 ? Big grin. So day 54.
Wait, let me say something here. The stuff that we also put on last week, and some of those courses, you know, with how you look at the horse and how you look at the saddles and materials, they are now up on the VBR equestrian.com.
Oh, good.
So anyone who actually wants to, you know, look at the horse conformation and look at, you know, parts of the saddle and materials in the saddle, I put a video together on that.
Okay, so what we can do, we can put that link in the comments under this video, which can be shown to the public. So I'll get the link for that. Great.
And that's on the I'm doing like what Bradley says the organization should have done. I got tired of waiting. So I started it just like you did.
Good.
Brilliant. Well, happy Christmas all, happy holidays. Thank you so much. And yeah, again, thank you. It's been absolutely jaw-dropping. So and thank you very much. And also for letting us to just being brave enough to broadcast live. And yes, we must do it again in about a month's time. So good night, everybody. And thank you for your attention.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Woo.